This is Need to Know. News, context, and analysis about anomalous phenomena. Here's some real talk from two authors who literally wrote the book on disclosure. From New York, Richard Dolan. From Los Angeles, Bryce Zabel. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Need to Know. I'm Richard Dolan, and this is my first time doing the lead of the discussion, but where I'm here with Bryce Zabel. I'll bring him in just 1 second. We're going to be talking about the latest UFO UAP documentary that has hit the world, and that is Age of Disclosure, produced by Dan Farah. It's gotten a lot of a buildup over the last several months, actually even over the last year, and it became available. It premiered in a number of theaters across the country, but I think most significantly for most people, it became available yesterday on Amazon Prime, where you can rent or buy it. And Bryce and I both have seen it, and we are here to talk about it. Bryce, why don't you come on?
Hey, Rich, boy, worth waiting for is the phrase I think about right now. And as you mentioned, it has been seen before. It debuted at South by Southwest so long ago, a lot of people put it out of their minds. It had trouble, I think, finding distribution, but it has. And just so everyone understands, we're talking about Age of Disclosure, directed by Dan Farah. It debuted on Amazon Prime, although in other theaters, as you mentioned, Rich, and that's because they want to be recognized as a serious contender for the Oscar race, frankly, for Best Documentary. And I think you'd have to say, based on the way people are reacting, they're probably right. I want everyone to understand, though, what's interesting about this documentary we just saw is it features a bipartisan group of 34 high-level members of not only the U.S. government, senators and representatives and the like, but intelligence people that include CIA directors and others, physicists, pilots. I mean, Rich, this was a cornucopia of UFO-dom. And the thing I just wanted to ask you about is, I had some friends over last night to watch with me. We put it up on the big screen. We had dinner beforehand. We watched it. We talked about it afterwards. And, as I'm watching it, I'm realizing there are a lot of different reactions going on here. I knew almost everything that was in it, and I'm assured that you must feel the same way. Some things were surprising that they were said out loud. My wife took a big steep level up on understanding how it all fits, because they took basically the last 3 years of my life and your life and it professionally and put them into this 90-minute documentary. My friends included one person who was a producer on a project, a drama pilot I've got called UAP. So she knows all about it, but her husband, not so much. So I kind of got the whole thing. Tell me how you watched it. What was your
I'll be interested in hearing about the reactions of the folks that you saw it with. I watched it with my wife, Tracy, last night, and so we're both kind of deeply ensconced in this subject. We both thought it was a very excellent treatment of the UFO UAP subject. We can get into some of the things about it. I would say that what's interesting about this film, like any good film on this subject, you're really going to have two types of audiences. You're going to have the longtime followers of this subject who already knew or know most of these names and the issues that are, going on. But then you've got a much larger public, and it's very obvious that Dan Farah is trying to reach that has only vaguely followed the hearings and the headlines since 2017, who don't know a lot. And so I think the film appeals to both of those types of audiences. I found myself thinking this is not just another UFO doc. This is a government and insider-centric film that really tries to tell the story from the inside out. And a lot of questions that came up. One that I'm sure many of the listeners of this podcast are wondering is, like, are we watching on the one hand, a carefully curated official narrative, or are we seeing the first real cracks in a very old, very deep system of secrecy? That's one set of questions that I would.
Do you go for either? And I go for option two. What's your take?
No, as do I. I've felt for quite some time, and I don't want to go on too long with this because there's a lot to cover, but I do think that there is a school of thought relating to like everything that we've been dealing with since 2017, because these are government people, Lue Elizondo, counterintelligence, Chris Mellon working with the Defense Department, and many of these other folks. So and that combined with the fact that you often hear the so-called threat narrative portrayed along when Lue speaks about this, he'll talk about that. And so, I often hear people reacting against this saying, well, he's just another government intel guy. You can't really trust what he has to say. And he's really just portraying a threat narrative to promote the military and to have the citizens go run into Big Daddy, who's the U.S. government and military. And then there's a number of folks out there who are not convinced that there is any potential threat anyway from these intelligences, and they think it's just fear mongering. Now, I can understand some of that perspective, but I don't share it. First of all, my own work for 30 years now has been to describe the UFO reality in conjunction with military encounters, which are often very dramatic, and you could at least argue are of a potentially threatening nature. Not that they are. But, for me to expect a guy like Lue not to go there, it's like I've always said, this is what you pay him for. He's in the military. He's in counterintelligence. His job literally is to look for threats and to deal with it. It's rather unfair, I think, to ask people who are trained this way not to do that. Having said all of that, I've never believed that he unduly promotes a threat narrative. I don't think that he's been anything other than straightforward and working the subject in good faith. That is my definitely strong opinion about it. I've talked to Lue, I've known him, and I think that's what he is. So I think on that basis, I've always felt that we're looking at not a centrally orchestrated rollout of a narrative by the government, which I don't even know if there's such a thing as the government. What I think is we're looking at a factional battle, which people like Donald Kehoe back in the 1950s was describing. Yeah. It's never been otherwise. There's always been factions within the establishment about how to proceed with this very difficult subject of UFOs or UAP. And I just think that what we're seeing is everyone around, really all the people around Robert Bigelow, that's really what you're looking at here. Lue Elizondo and all the old National Institute for Discovery Science and then ATIP. That group has been engaged in a battle with what they call the legacy program. And I think that's probably a good way to look at it. So I kind of liked that perspective. It's one that I have already agreed with. And you really get a lot of that out in the film. Last thing I'll just say, and I'll hand this back to you. For someone who's looking for really like hardcore evidence of UFO or UAP sightings that can't be explained, this film is kind of light on that. There are a couple of cases that are discussed, very nicely done, but it's brief. The real core of this is you're hearing insiders. Hal Puthoff was one of them. There was a lot of Hal Puthoff and some Eric Davis, as well as Chris Mellon and Jay Stratton, Gary Nolan. These people had very, very interesting points to make on a number of aspects of this subject. A lot of it, the internal battle, a little bit on the science, and much more. I think it was very worthwhile to hear these individuals talk about the subject the way they did.
Well, I agree with that. A lot to unpack there. A couple of quick shots. You talked about the evidence. That is something I thought about because I started looking through X today and some other social media. And of course, there's always going to be the people who say, well, show me the receipts, right? One thing I thought that the show did pretty well was to say receipts are hard to get. The government, which classifies them, doesn't hand them out. They didn't give them to Lue when he left the Pentagon to show us. However, for my own money, the one tweak I might have added is to, at the end of that section talking about evidence, they could have explained a little more clearly why evidence is so hard to find. They did take it on, but it wouldn't have hurt if they said, but for those of you who do want to see something, here are the 10 best UFO photos of all time, and then show us those, so that it would have kind of given just a little pinpoint of focus for that. Maybe show us a couple of the great the videos. They didn't do that. I wanted to ask you, though, Rich, I wanted to talk about Lue Elizondo for a moment, because for folks who were joining us, they know that, Lue was the former Defense Department official who was associated with ATIP, as you said, counterintelligence. They did a pretty good job explaining who he is. His take, of course, is that we've been part of a 80-year cover-up. Now, the thing is, to the people in the room with me last night, they took Elizondo for who he is. There he is. He's Lue Elizondo. And in terms of just as a producer, as a TV producer, he delivered one of his best performances. If this was a live play, I would have said, hey, he brought the goods. And he did. But
I agree.
He's a controversial guy, right? So for a lot of people, they're going, please, not Lue Elizondo, because a lot of people don't like him in the UFO world. In the outer world, I don't think they think one way or the other about him. It is possible. It is possible that even amongst, even for myself, I was thinking to myself, maybe Lue Elizondo is reaching the end of his shelf life, as this public leader, maybe somebody else. From a casting point of view, he holds the show together. He is the guy. He is the narrator. They go back to him. I've never seen more images of a guy walking around Washington, D.C. by himself than I did last night.
Well,
that was
he and Jay Stratton were listed as executive producers right after Dan Farrow. So they were obviously very involved in it. You could tell.
And right then there's a certain amount of talk about the friction between the two of them over the past year or so, but they didn't seem to show it on camera. Yeah. Interesting thing that we probably should note is, because this thing debuted at South by Southwest in, was that February of this year? March?
Yeah.
Okay, that means it was, being shot in 24 and all that. A lot of time has elapsed. And so there's little moments of it where you go, maybe it could, we've evolved past some of that. And then finally, I'll just leave you with this. The producer and me watching it is going, well, Elizondo's really good. I wonder how Tom Hanks would have done if he'd, because you just go, if you're trying to reach the American people, who knows? But actually, I have one other thing I just want to throw at you. So today I start surfing around doing my, various looks into things. And I ended up watching two things. I watched a clip with Jake Tappert interviewing Dan Farrow, the director. And I watched a clip on Fox News with Brett Baer interviewing David Grush. All right. And Rich, you and I wrote a book, 80 After Disclosure, about trying to define when disclosure is and then kind of how it happens. So I'm watching these two clips. Both Brett Baer and Jake Tapper, who, again, you got CNN, you got Fox, both of them did not go there where they go, come on, crashed wreckage and reverse engineering. Come on, man. Right. None of that. They accepted in their interviews as fact that there was crash wreckage, there were bodies. They did not contest that. These interviews were not about that. These interviews were about, where is this going and that kind of thing. And of what amused me most is we know that Donald Trump does kind of hire from his administration from Fox News. He's done that in the past. And we also know that he watches it. And oftentimes people who are speaking on Fox are speaking directly through the camera to him.
Oh, yeah.
Well, David Grush started talking about what a good president Trump has been, and then started saying how he thought, maybe he didn't say he was such a great, I don't remember exactly the words, but he did say that Trump had the possibility of being the most historic president ever. And I watched that I thought, is this the audition for David Grush to be the Secretary of Inhuman Affairs or whatever? Because, Trump has that possibility, and the number one, a guy who's very important in his administration starred in that show as well, and that was Marco Rubio.
Yeah, all of those points are extremely relevant. One of the things about this film that is definitely noteworthy is the amount of attention that it is getting from the establishment media, from the mainstream media, and I don't know that there's really been anything like this that's happened on a treatment of that's, coming out to be a serious treatment of the UFO cover-up. I mean, this isn't even one of these documentaries asking like, are UFOs real? What's the evidence? No,
Right.
this is dealing with the actual cover up and the secret, not so secret now, war going on between the legacy program and let's call them the reformers, for lack of a better word. So that's an unusual and interesting angle to go. And there was a lot of attention. In the buildup to this, you see Farah on all kinds of, from Bill Maher to Fox to CNN and many other locations just talking about this. And as you pointed out with the other interviews, being taken seriously and not being challenged in any fundamental way on what he's trying to say. So that's reflective of the sea change in the culture that we have seen since really 2017. And that is absolutely something that's important. Like, I find myself asking how much of the needle is going to be moved as a result of this. I'm sure you've asked yourself. I'm sure many people watching are wondering, like, is this really going to make a difference? And I can't really know if is this going to trigger a genuine disclosure? Will Donald Trump come up to the podium in the near future and say, yep, it's all real?
Right.
I don't think that. I really don't expect that. And not even whether it's from him or from any other successive president that there may be. It's not something that I'm expecting. However, I have to assume, as I think you do, and I think as a lot of people do, that we're not in a stable situation where today is always going to look like yesterday and tomorrow is going to look like today. Because we have to expect a change. At some point, I do expect the cracks will be significant enough that it's going to cause a problem. I think of this film as a very good evidence that there are fissures in the system, cracks in the empire, one way to look at it. The United States, we call ourselves a republic, we call ourselves a democracy, okay, whatever you prefer, but it has really been an empire for the past, since World War II at the least, and it's been operated like one. And that empire's got some problems with it these days, and there is discontent. There are long-term issues, there are medium-term issues. For something like that, an empire that's dealing with some problems, we'll say, you could see, I can at least imagine a scenario in where more and more cracks in the system appear. So I look at Farah's film, I look at these, the individuals that he brought on, all government people, as yet more evidence that the system is no longer able, as it once was, to maintain itself in a totally coherent way to keep that secret in place. I just think it's becoming harder and harder for them.
A couple of years ago, I had lunch with Dan Farah, and I didn't know him at the time, but we had a mutual friend in Ernie Klein. And
I'm friends with Ernie Klein.
Great guy.
Ernie wrote the book Ready Player One, which of course Dan, along with I think Spielberg, produced. Oh no, Ernie's a great guy.
A terrific guy, knows so much about this topic too. He's terrific, and he set this lunch up. So I met with Dan, and he was talking about this thing, and of course it hadn't come out. But when he was first talking about it, I was thinking, well, a lot of those guys are already being interviewed, and whatever, we'll see. But it's the sheer volume of putting them together that was kind of impressive, but something else was impressive. If you go to Amazon right now, and I did, and type in aliens and UFOs, and what you end up seeing is, I would say possibly hundreds of documentaries that are just on Amazon. And so I started watching like 5 minutes of each one. And a lot of them have that portentous narrator. A lot of them just or look like fan fiction. There aren't a lot of great ones from a production point of view. And the one thing I want to give Dan really good props for is the production value of Age of Disclosure was really, really quite good. And that was important to me because when production value is good, it also says this is important, folks. People have spent some money trying to get it right, and they've thought about how to present it. So even the way that Dan conducted the interviews, where the people they had interesting lighting, they were in interesting locations, and for the ones that he shot originally, there was a consistency to all of them. It had a really nice look to it. It did not have the portentous narrator. It had Lue Elizondo mostly tying it all together, although other voices tied from one segment to another segment to another segment. So I just thought there have been some nice things done in the last few years from a production point of view. Spielberg did a 4-part series, I think, and I think J.J. Abrams did. So there's been good stuff, but not as much. And this was the kind of one that a lot of people have been waiting for when their friends go, I don't really know anything about this. What do you know? You can say, well, we'll check this one out. Because I do have friends who I'll see at a meal or whatever, and they'll say, well, yeah, tell me what's going on. And what they really mean is I got 3 minutes here before the French fries come, and I want you to unload it. I would rather say to them, why don't you watch Age of Disclosure and then let me know about it. But the one thing I will say that potentially will have to be worked out later is there's a high price to entrance for Age of Disclosure, and the price is $25. That's what it costs to watch it on Amazon.
Well, you rent it for $20, buy for $25. I mean, that difference is just buy.
It's not much of a difference. Now, obviously, the future, they're going to lower the price and more people will see it. So I think a lot of people that saw it, that will be listening to us right now that saw it previously, are people that are already interested in it. And when the next wave will come when the price comes down, and then people are able, who just have heard about it, maybe will start to watch it. But, you asked about my friends who were there. The one who was the skeptic, he's a data analyst and kind of a skeptical person in general. Not in a bad way, just a person that basically says, show me the receipts. And he's had to, just as my wife Jackie has had to tolerate my, UFO fascination over the years, he's tolerated his wife's fascination. And, he's a good humored guy. And
so
at the halfway,
his problems with it?
Well, at the halfway point, we sort of took a break so everybody could use the bathroom and get some dessert or whatever, and then came back in. And he seemed like, I think he wanted to see, he would have liked to have seen some things where he goes, don't know what that is. Look at that. He didn't get to look at that. He got the sound bites. But by the end of it, he felt like, well, that makes the case pretty well, because these are not nobodies that are speaking. And by the way, Farah did another nice thing with that. The chyrons at the bottom were 3 lines. The first line was the name, but then they gave enough in the second and third that you really say, this guy or this woman, they're not nothing. These are major, major people who are speaking. And my friend asked 2 questions at the end that I'm going to throw to you as well. He said, I found myself by the end of this thing asking myself, why now? Why is this documentary being pushed now? Which I thought was a good question, one that you and I have certainly gone around about. And then he said one that I thought was bait for you. He said, who profits from doing it now? And I thought, that's because who does profit from an emerging disclosure? There's so many people aligned against it. Lue Elizondo was talking about feeling like he was targeted potentially for murder, right? So who profits by letting this out now?
I think your friend's questions were rather unfortunate. I'm sure he's a great guy, but I don't think those are the best questions a skeptic could ask.
Oh,
there's
well,
way better approaches. If I were a real skeptic, I'd be like, okay, so where are the primary documents? Because there's not much of that.
That's true.
The film relies on testimony and personal authority. Now, that's not the worst thing to do, but a skeptic's going to say, show me the document, show me the data, the contract, the budget, whatever. There's also, from a skeptical point of view, there's not any really clear, unambiguous retrieval proof that is presented. So there's compelling insider talk, but there's not the direct kind of evidence that's going to move a hardened skeptic materialist. Like there's no there were some photos, but not mostly artistic renderings. There's no hardware on the table, no forensic report, nothing like that. There's a few other things, but your friend, unfortunately, both of those questions really had nothing to do with the content of the presentation.
Probably true.
He ignored the entire any of the claims that were made. One of the fascinating things, even if you are not a believer in this, you have to start wondering, why the hell do you have this factional war in plain sight, because that's really what this film is showing.
That's true.
To me, one of the things that got me interested in UFOs years ago wasn't the question like, is it real? I mean, I was curious about that. Of course, anyone's curious. But really what blew my mind was learning, oh my God, even back in the 40s and 50s and through the 60s, there were like seriously minded, high-level military officials who were taking this subject seriously. And on top of that, of course, you could read some declassified documents through Freedom of Information, which are always worth reading, by the way. And so to me, I was just interested in asking, why did these very, very highly responsible, clearly intelligent people believe that this was absolutely real? Like, let's listen to the evidence. And so that the film portrayed that exceptionally well. It showed that there is a serious factional war. On top of that, I would like your friend to have brought up, Hal Puthoff or Eric Davis, who were pretty prominently featured, particularly Puthoff, who they went into this whole discussion on his theory of how and why these craft move the way they do. The whole kind of warping of space, time, essentially around the craft was a very interesting discussion. And, many of us have probably heard Hal Puthoff or Eric Davis speak about this from time to time. There are clips and there are statements.
It's also in Elizondo's book, Imminent.
Imminent,
he
yeah.
devotes a chapter to it. Yeah.
That's right. And so things like that are really quite interesting. And I would just think, even if you're a skeptic, but if you're an intelligent person and at least have some measure of curiosity about you, these would be things that I should think should trigger the curiosity of anyone. It's like, why do you have a guy like Puthoff who's pushing 90, who's had, it wasn't really stated in this documentary, but he's probably had more years being qualified for top secret sensitive compartmented information than possibly anyone else alive. Him and Kit Green, very possibly. I mean, they're both well over 50,
Absolutely.
maybe 60 years worth. So, but his credentials were certainly portrayed, and he did state, I had senior scientists with many years involved in UAP programs. He said that. He's clearly a brilliant, serious man, and he's speaking the way he is. I would think, a skeptical person would at least be wondering, wow, I suspect that what we will hear moving forward from hardened skeptics, and there are always going to be such people, is really the only tactic you can take, I think, is by impugning the credibility of the people involved and just say they're disinformation artists, they're disinformation people.
They sure don't play that way. I mean, you listen to him, you talk about Puthoff, he's so featured in this thing that you really feel like you get to know the man. Mm-hmm. At the beginning, you say, well, I don't know this guy, but I mean, I know who he is, but if you're just coming new to the thing, I don't know this guy, but you come to have a deep appreciation for him because he doesn't seem to exceed his brief. He's not going beyond what he thinks he knows, and he implies he knows a lot, but there's a limit to what he's able to say. So I thought that was interesting. Another thing, by the way, you are correct. Certain things were just tossed off. I love the detail around the various concepts, but there were a few times where they would toss off a detail and just state it as a fact, and you go, wait a minute, what? Like one of them I wrote down was, they said the CIA has funded Hollywood movies. Well, that's something I know a little bit about, and that was it. That's all they said. And I thought, well, wait a minute, why is that in there if you're not going to give an example or whatever? I don't want to impugn my one friend, though, because another friend wrote me today, and he wrote an email. He said, I really enjoyed it. I felt like I learned a decent amount. Some of it felt pretty heavy to me, which I thought was an interesting comment. It helps to put all of the noise and random events of the last few years in one place to fully understand the whistleblowers, hearings, sightings, and the legacy program, which I did think is kind of what Dan Farah must have had in mind, that by bringing all these people together, you don't have to believe any one of them, and you could even disbelieve several of them if they went too far. But the collective web that they're building is credibility. There's just so many. You got CIA directors saying this.
Well, yeah.
You have to dismiss all of them. Though. But your point is, you'd have to. You don't have to believe all of them. But, yeah,
I'm so sorry.
Go ahead. No.
Well, James Clapper was in there, and I do not have the highest opinion of James Clapper. That's putting it mildly.
Okay.
However, and he was in there stating that there's probably life in the universe. He wasn't really saying, I don't believe he was anywhere, because I've listened to a lot of his statements on this. He's never been like a disclosure person.
And it was an old clip, by the way. It was an old clip. He didn't get interviewed for this documentary like some of the others did. That was just one sensational clip he made a couple, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
I mean, Clapper's a guy who lied to Congress about NSA spying to the American public. So right off the bat, I'm not a fan of him. But he didn't really need to be there. I thought he was kind of window dressing.
Although that kind of illustrates my point. Let's subtract him out. Okay? Take that guy out, throw him out of the documentary, cut him out, leave him on the cutting room floor. Then you got 33 other people to deal with, if you're a skeptic. And not all of them have that kind of problem. And I'll tell you the one that really stood out to me is the Rubio interviews. Now, Marco Rubio is currently our Secretary of State. But when he was recorded for Age of Disclosure, he was a senator from Florida who was on the Senate Intelligence Committee, very outspoken. Well, he was extremely well-spoken on this thing. He felt honest and credible, and he did a really lovely job of explaining how it would be possible that two things, that a president might not know everything about this thing, and that you could have a secret, and then if it's being held by the people on the team, people retire. Then a new guy comes in, he doesn't know nearly as much as the first guy. Then a new person comes in, and that person may not know anything. And that's kind of how this compartmentalization that we've had leaves when you silo things off, sometimes the silo goes silent. And Rubio, I feel like that's what was happening.
That was I'm very glad you reminded me of that. That was one of his best moments.
Yeah.
And you're right. He was very well spoken on this. His point was, you have government people, they're here and then they're gone. There are the high level bureaucrats just below the person who's appointed secretary, whatever. Those bureaucrats are lifers. And he also talked about the contractors. It's like as the government people get cycled through, just as you were pointing out, the contractors are always there. And he says at some point, you're in a situation where the contractors know way more than the actual government people. And I think, was it Rubio who said, even if the president wanted to ask, would he even know where to begin looking for information on this?
That's exactly what he said. And I thought that's a good point.
Exactly. It's like how you're dealing with a system now. The U.S. government is such a massive labyrinthian system. How do you know where these secrets are kept? And that's
something else that stood out to me. Maybe you heard this before. I had not. They did have the standard clips. They had Obama on a television show talking about it. They had George Bush on a television show talking about it. They had Clinton talking about it. But I've always thought the guy that knew the most was probably George Herbert Walker Bush. That is Bush the first, right? Eric Davis started talking about that. I'm going to read this quote because I just think it's something we should talk about.
I'm really glad you're doing this.
Yeah. Eric Davis said, I had a few private conversations with former President George Herbert Walker Bush in 2003, in which he told me that when he became the CIA director in the Ford administration, he was not briefed on the legacy UAP crash retrieval program, but he later found out about it. And he informed me that there were a number of crash retrievals that had taken place since the mid-1940s. And he also informed me of a UAP event that took place at Holloman Air Force Base in 1964, where 3 UAPs approached the Air Force Base. One of them landed on the tarmac, and a non-human entity deboarded the craft that landed and interacted with uniformed Air Force and civilian CIA personnel. And when he asked for more details, he was told he did not, wait for it, he did not have a need to know. So we did get our show title in there with thanks to Eric Davis and George H.W. Bush. But, Rich, when he said that, I had always thought that if there was ever a great presidential deathbed confession waiting to be had, it might have been George Herbert Walker Bush, because he seemed like, he knew things. And this
you have to have a conscience to do deathbed confession.
I know. So, well, we can argue that for sure. But it is interesting because I had not heard Davis say this before. Had you heard this before?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, you had.
It's
a
statement he has made. I don't know when he started, but yes, definitely was.
Okay, well, great.
I was glad to hear it. And
what does that mean then? George Herbert Walker Bush knew about Holloman Air Force Base. He knew about crash retrievals and all that.
Correct.
So I guess you kind of wonder.
And at Holloman, one of the things Davis said regarding that, I think you mentioned this, were the interaction with alien beings.
Yeah,
like that's. I mean, the Holloman lore. This has been discussed almost since it happened. James and Coral Lorenzen, legendary private researchers way back in the 60s, they learned about this the week it happened, or they learned that something important had happened as it occurred. So it's been written about, it's been discussed. There's been a lot, but for Davis to talk about this about George W. Bush, that's very significant. And again, you'll have skeptics who will say, well, that's not the same as proof. Okay, well, fine. I will agree. We will agree that's not the same as proof, but is it not an interesting thing, at least for us to consider and to follow up on?
It's worth thinking about and to follow up on. But I think you're right, though, because earlier you were talking about, people saying, well, lay the proof on me. Well, that is the problem. This is Eric Davis reporting on a conversation he had with George Bush. So it's not primary. It's not George Bush the first telling you this and looking in the camera and saying, yes, I knew about Holloman. It's somebody telling about it. And I found it also ironic that Eric Davis is also the guy that said he had the conversation with Thomas Wilson of the Wilson-Davis memo. So again, Eric Davis seems to be the guy who's willing to say, yeah, I talked to somebody and he told me this. And if you've done a lot of reading, you go, he's probably right on about that. And I know you've done a lot on the Wilson-Davis memo. And yet, if you're the super skeptic, you go, well, that's hearsay.
Yeah, no, there will always be hardened skeptics who, you could shout at them with a megaphone and it won't change their opinion. So the thing is, we're in a world that, unfortunately, for us, we sometimes go on this assumption that information is always freely, readily available. We live in an open society, and there's freedom of inquiry. And there is freedom of inquiry on a lot of things, but there is not freedom of inquiry on many other aspects of our world, and that is the reality. The reality also is that we have an opaque, not a transparent system of government on many, many levels. It's extremely opaque. And in fact, I would go so far as to say it runs 180 degrees opposite in reality to what the rhetoric often tells us. So we're not in the world that our official ideology likes to tell us. And I often feel some of these skeptically inclined people, they're not really understanding the kind of world that we live in. And this is a world that is built in many ways on secrecy. It's very hard to prove a negative. It's hard sometimes to prove the secrecy. I get that, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And so I just feel like when you get someone like Davis, who's clearly a highly brilliant man, his record, his history is a matter of public record, so you can see what he's done in his career and the classified at least a lot of the classified work he's done is, I don't think, up for dispute. Same with Hal Puthoff. And when you have these guys, someone like Puthoff saying in the documentary, matter of factly, that there are multiple types of alien beings that are here, which he said.
He said it.
And you have Davis, who said on this occasion there were 2 specifically, although in the past he said 4. But for this documentary, he said 2. Be interesting to see why there's a difference here. But nonetheless, when you have people like that making these statements, to me, that is an important cultural moment. And it's not the same as proof, but I would like to think that a reasonably intelligent, skeptical person would not just dismiss those with a wave of the hand either.
You touched on one of my favorite moments in the thing, not because it was called out as a favorite moment, but the way it personally affected me. I'm a kind of a Roswell aficionado, and it's always felt to me for the last 30 years, like, come on, folks, this happened. And there's been so much pushback. And what I really found intriguing about this thing is it kind of happens just kind of tossed off about halfway through, where they basically treat Roswell like, of course, Roswell, right? And so I wrote down a couple of the things that these people said about Roswell. Let me just read these real quickly. Jay Stratton, who was one of the former UAP task force bosses, said, it was described to be a boot-heel-shaped UAP that broke into 2 pieces on impact, and observers saw what looked like hieroglyphics or some type of writing on it. The recovered material from the crash, including the bodies, were all sent up to Wright Field, which is now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. That's where the U.S. had their best reverse engineers. Okay, crazy. Then Elizondo comes on and says, in ATIP, we learned that the UAP event at the U.S. Army Airfield in Roswell in 1947 did actually occur. You might actually describe them as runes or glyphs, hieroglyphs that were actually on the craft itself. And within that crash, non-human bodies were recovered. And finally, our man Eric Davis said 4 non-human bodies were recovered from the UAP crash at Roswell. And again, they're providing details of something that, if I go to the local mall and say, did Roswell happen? There's going to be a lot of debate about it. Most people aren't going to say yes. So I found that interesting. I don't know where you come down on Roswell. We haven't talked about that for a while.
Oh, I strongly support the narrative that Roswell was the recovery of something non-human. I think that's the best conclusion that you can come to on it. I think it's actually a really good UFO crash retrieval case. And, the only problem we've had with Roswell is that it was kind of talked to death for years in the community. And I just think a lot of people got some fatigue from it. Come back. Combined with the fact that, yes, there was a lot of evidence presented, but there was still no admission from the government. And, the skeptics just dug in their heels. And so you're not going to get a consensus. And I think a lot of people just threw up their hands eventually and moved on to other things. But Roswell, I think, is a very strong case. I want to ask this. I want to come back to the question of narrative control here, because I sense that within even the UAP or UFO community, as well as beyond, there's going to be a number of skeptical questions that we'll ask. Here's one that I've heard many times. I'm sure you have. If this is truly so sensitive, why are these particular people allowed to speak so freely? Aren't we being given a managed or partial disclosure that serves some agenda? So let me throw that out for you. And do you have, what do you think? Why would, I've got some thoughts on this, but I don't want to step all over your ideas here, unless you want to just.
Well, listen, I mean, I've had the same question myself, with time. And of course, many people got very upset with Lue Elizondo saying, well, I can't talk about that. I have an NDA and things like that. You will notice, though, that they confirmed things, but they didn't show the receipts. They didn't have the photo. Right. They didn't have the document or whatever. You know what? I'm going to defer long enough to hear your point of view while I gather my thoughts on this thing, because that's
a loaded question, and we didn't talk about it before. I didn't want to, hijack or ambush you with that.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say is I think that the people discussing this, so whether it was Lue Elizondo or Mellon or Puthoff, what you see with them is that they talked about these very sensitive matters without actually giving up genuinely classified information. Like I have no doubt that every one of them knew what was their line, what they could go over. I don't think it's ever been actually illegal for someone, even in the classified world, to give a public opinion that they believe in UFOs. And I don't even know that it was always illegal for someone in the classified world to say, yes, there are definitely UFO crashes.
Hey, Rich, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jay Stratton took that, what he believes, one step further, and he did it early. Jay Stratton said, and this is a quote, "I have seen with my own eyes non-human craft and non-human beings." Now, that's not an opinion,
however,
but it's not the pictures either. It's and he didn't provide the details of it. He's never told us what it looked like.
He didn't give the context of it.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, that could have been in his capacity as a private citizen.
Right.
Like, I mean, I don't know that was, and I doubt that it was, but this is my point. Like, they are making these statements in such a way that they're still in safe territory. But I would bet that, like, none of these people, well, in fact, we don't have to bet. We know none of these people were saying anything like this 10 years ago.
None.
I knew Hal Puthoff 10 years ago. I knew his opinions on UFOs 10 years ago. I knew his opinions on UFOs 20 years ago. And I knew for a fact that he felt very constrained about speaking publicly. And partly because, yes, he had clearances, he had to be careful about them, but also just because this would have been a very difficult career move. He had colleagues in his community that he would have to deal with, and it just would not have looked good. But the reality is that in the last decade, there's been so much erosion on this subject, so much of erosion of the walls of secrecy and the cultural stigma that that's really not an issue anymore. It's just not an issue. So I think what you're finding is these people are feeling much more at liberty to go a little bit further into it, and they're getting away with it.
I find the Puthoff thing that you just mentioned to be pretty informative. Hal Puthoff said on television last night things that he probably didn't quite say to you in person 20 years ago, right? Did he literally say those things that he was saying out loud to you personally 20 years ago?
I can't, even now.
Even now,
I feel constrained to go into the details, only because this is why. The conversations that I had with him and a few other individuals, not just him, were made in confidence. And
of course,
but
he never said it in public, though. I guess forget what he told you. He was not saying these things in public 20 years ago, and now he is. So you're right. The line of, well, what is acceptable for me to say has so radically changed since 2017 that again, we got network anchors just going, yeah, of course, the crash wreckage, reverse engineering wars, as if they're accepted fact now. I have to tell you, one of my favorite moments was just personal, though. I'm watching this thing, and I wrote a movie in 1993. It was called Official Denial. It was on the Sci-Fi Channel, and it was about a UFO crash. And one of the things that happens in the movie that I made is the craft has its own size and shape when they look at it on the outside, but when they go inside, they go, holy shit, look how big this thing is. And I remember at the time putting that in there thinking, well, this will be a fun thing to shoot on, for a movie. But last night on the Age of Disclosure, that's exactly what they talked about. A craft that might look 40 feet long on the outside, when people have gone in it, look like a football field. And that blew my mind. And by the way, I'm still not sure why that's the case. I do understand the space-time bubble and all that for missing time and all that, but why does something look smaller on the outside and look bigger when you go inside it?
All right. Well, a couple of things there. So one is that some people will remember this as well. A couple of years ago, David Grush spoke in New York City to a bunch of, I think, hedge fund managers, if I'm not mistaken, and happened to talk to them about UAP and the craft and so on. And a statement of his leaked out where he was explicitly saying what came out in the documentary, by the way, in the words of Puthoff last night, but Grush a couple of years ago said, we knew of a craft that was 40 feet diameter on the outside, but inside it was bigger than a football field. And he said that came out. And that is not the first time that many of us have heard such things. So we can get into the whys in a second. But I think it's very interesting that it was Puthoff who mentioned that exact same type of scenario in the documentary, whereas time doesn't move the same way. And also he said space is not the same inside these craft. Right. And I think he gave the example of a 40-foot craft being much larger on the inside. So I am certain that he and Grush are talking about the same exact crash. Like, absolutely. I will bet you that there is a craft like that that they are all aware of. And it is, yeah, go on.
I was just going to say, one of the things that happens is they put Lue Elizondo up in front of a chalkboard, and he's like underlining things. He looks like a college professor. What's that?
He's doing the 5 observables, which I really
but he looks like a college professor teaching a class about it, which I thought was kind of amusing. I kind of liked it. And then they start getting into the space-time bubble and that kind of thing. And the one thing that is kind of intriguing about what they said is we seem to be making some progress in trying to understand from a physics point of view, et cetera, on how some of this actually might work. So without getting into all the details of space-time bubbles, it does explain missing time, where one of them, I forget who said it, but you go inside, you think you spent a couple of minutes in there and you come out and everybody's like, what'd you do in there for 3 hours? Right. Yeah. And that would explain why abductees might have missing time, et cetera. So,
it also would explain, as Puthoff said, why these things are so difficult to see and photograph and record.
Yes.
He said because it's like there's a shield, a space-time shield or bubble around them that is warping space and time around it. And so you're not really getting a good view of it. And that's why they sometimes seem blurry and what have you. So I thought, I'm glad he got into that.
I thought, by the way, of you last night when I was watching it and they started talking about USOs, because I thought, yes, get that out there, because you must have been thinking to yourself, about damn time we started giving, equal time to the USO thing. And the way they put it, the way they laid it out there, I thought was very interesting, because you really got the sense that they were trying to just say this, please do not focus on just the air. This is, when we say transmedium, we're not talking about their like tourist transmedium. There's something going on. They're in the water. And they literally started talking about maybe they're living in the water. And
yeah, there's
a pretty big thing for a bunch of high level government people to start talking about, I thought.
Yeah, I kept thinking up and thought, I was like, wow, the fact that I just kind of haphazardly almost fell into the USO subject a little over 3 years ago, I was like, it's pretty good timing, because it has kind of blown up totally independent of anything that I've had to do about it. So that was kind of fortuitous for me. But I was glad that they brought up the USO connections when they did. Tim Gallaudet, the admiral, discussing it. And I think it might have been Lue Elizondo or someone, maybe not him, talking about that these objects were tracked going underwater at several hundred miles per hour.
Right.
I think that might have been Lou. But yeah, I mean, all of the things that I had been looking at in my own research of USOs, I was very glad to see that they were treating that.
That was one of the things, by the way, Rich, that I was glad that they did. I tried to talk to my friends and explain, well, they're really doing things they made it real. 200 miles per hour. We know what that is. That's fast. If you're in a car going 200 miles an hour, you're a race car driver. And the very thought of doing that underwater, pretty extraordinary. They don't really have things. And I liked how they made clear how fast these things were going compared to how fast our fastest of the fast go, and blowing it away. And also the comparison about the 100 times the energy of the United States in a day.
Oh, yes.
Is what it takes to power one craft.
One of these objects. Yeah.
With a space-time bubble.
Davis said that, and one other individual. Yeah, that was very noteworthy. We've heard this before too. This has been out there. It was very good that they brought that up. So, there was a lot for this film that, people who are interested in this subject, I know it's expensive, but if you're genuinely interested in this subject, it's not a bad thing just to buy the thing and have it, or wait till the price drops and then check it out.
I would watch it at this point frankly, I'd watch it if you were deeply interested or not deeply interested, because either way, you're going to gain something from it. I did think one final kind of a concluding thought. For years, we've been the AD guys because we had After Disclosure. And now there's a new AD guy on the block, Age of Disclosure. And I had a friend write me today who said, I got a lot of email this morning, and this one said, wow, now I want to reread your book, because their feeling was this is the beginning. By Age of Disclosure, he's really talking about a time frame. He's not saying it's the single event, it's the age where it's starting to happen. And my friend thought that is exactly what seems to be happening based on looking at this thing and seeing this sheer number of people who are involved in it, that we seem to be moving in that direction. So it made me start to think about some of the predictions we made in AD. It made me wonder if maybe it's going to be a little easier, maybe a little bit, because a lot of people are looking at this going, yeah, whatever. I mean, when I see the news guys sort of saying, yeah, it's all real, maybe it won't be quite as shocking, but who knows? They did quote Steve Mnuchin as saying to, who was it that was in Mnuchin? Was it Stratton in Mnuchin's office? Somebody, and Mnuchin said, or asked him, what will this do
economically, financially?
Yeah, financially, because I need to know before I can recommend the president walks up to a microphone and says anything. So there are going to be a lot of things to sort out in the future. Why don't we do last thoughts? What are your last thoughts on this thing?
I would say, for me, this is not the finish line of disclosure. Okay.
Right on.
Some people saying this is disclosure. It's happening. It's already happening. I would not at all go that far, nor would I want to wager that this is going to trigger a genuine U.S. government disclosure. I frankly doubt it. But I would say, if it's not the finish line, let's call it a significant mile marker. I think it confirms a lot of what many of us have either known or suspected for a long time. And the thing that most significantly comes out to me is that it shows the internal struggle more clearly than anything that we've seen so far in terms of a film treatment. And I think that's very significant. You could see, like, this is the reformer faction essentially fighting the legacy faction. That, I think, is an accurate framing of the reality of this. And I think the film portrays it very well. So I was happy about that.
I do have one thought, which is people preceding this were saying, hey, this could be the thing that starts disclosure. No, it's not going to start disclosure. It'll be subsumed into the body politic and the minds of people, and it will be important, but people aren't going to look back and say, boy, when Age of Disclosure was released, that changed, unless Trump goes out today and says something because he just watched it, then you would have to give it that historical note. But I don't think it's going to be that. But what I did notice by watching it was it felt like it was a documentary that chronicled the time we're in. It did accomplish its goal by trying to say we are living in an age of disclosure. We're not there, but we're living in it. And here's a snapshot of what the thinking is at this point in time in 2025. And for that, I think that's good. Is it a perfect film? No. I mean, nothing's a perfect film. It's got flaws. And by the way, it's interesting that in our conversation, some of the things I think are flaws are not necessarily what you think, and you think some of the people in it shouldn't be in it. And I'm just like, oh, I thought they were okay. I mean, people are going to have different opinions about this. but they are going to start talking. And to me, this is a conversation starter. It's not the thing that ends it or starts disclosure, capital D, but it is going to be the thing where, yeah, I could show this to my friends and not have them think I've gone off the deep end. They'll be deeply compelled by what they're listening to. So that's it for today, I guess, on Need to Know. And I know you're going to do your own show later, which I can't wait to listen to as well. But it's always good to talk to you about this stuff.
I'm glad we did this. And I think we have a similar take on the film. I suspect most people who follow this subject are going to also feel similarly. I have to think there are always going to be people who love to, they're going to complain, they're going to bitch. There are people who will, and there will be people even in our own community who are going to call this some kind of disinformation. I know that there are folks out there already.
Of course.
And I just ask myself, like, what would you prefer? I'm going to end on this, if I may.
Yeah, please.
For years and years and years, before 2017 especially, you go to a UFO event or you talk to other people in the field, and it was typically the case that we would be thinking, are we ever going to make any progress? And it was always with like the perceived need, I think correctly perceived need, that you want to get the United States government moving on this, like that there was this great disconnect between the government and the people, where the people are encountering this UFO phenomenon. The government's saying nothing about it. Year in, year out, we're dealing with this, thinking all we're getting is disinformation and silence from the government. Then suddenly, after 2017, you have a faction from within that establishment who's saying, yeah, you guys have actually been right. There is this phenomenon. There's been all this secrecy about it. And there are nonetheless people who will be throwing rotten eggs at these folks. And I just think, what would you rather have? Would you rather have us back where we were before 2017? Because that was a situation where this subject wasn't even able to be discussed in a public venue in any way.
Oh.
And then with Lue, I just want to say this last thing.
Yeah, please.
The people who are in the UFO community who are after him, I'm saying, well, you're in some interesting company, because the DOD, now the Department of War, was trying to smear him for years.
Absolutely.
For years. That to me is more than evidence. That's proof of an inside factional war going on. If you really follow how that whole thing played out, Elizondo was subject of, and they brought this up a little bit in the film last night, some very serious smear attacks, personal attacks, professional against him by his colleagues within the defense community. So, I wonder what some of these people really would like to see. Do you want a government official to come out and not talk about a potential threat? What universe are you living in? The only way you're ever going to get members of Congress to look at this matter is you shake them at the shoulders and you say, there is something serious going on here. There are military encounters that are actually very grave and serious. This is what got me into this subject 30 years ago, was the military encounters.
Right.
And so that's not the sum total of what the UAP or UFO phenomenon is. There's much more to it. Of course there is. But if you're trying to get a rigid establishment to look at this, like, let's say, members of Congress, you're going to have to go, you're going to have to go to some kind of threat narrative, because there's no other way they were going to put their lives, their careers, and their asses on the line for a subject like this, unless they had something like that to go on. That's just the reality. And to ignore that is, in my opinion, living in a kind of fantasy land where you just think, oh yeah, well, I want my government officials to talk about this, but I don't want them to talk about the threat because I believe all the aliens are good. So I want them to talk about higher dimensionality, or I want them to talk about the Galactic Federation of Light. Well, that's not going to happen. No, that is not how this is ever going to get into the public. So, I think one needs to have some realism about what we are dealing with. If you're going to have the establishment in any way to deal with this matter, it's going to be handled only in a certain way and not other ways. And that's just the reality.
Amen to that, Brother Dolan. I agree. It's funny, as I close here, I remember when Ross Coulthard and I started this show back 3.5 years ago or whatever. I had a catchphrase I used, and I used that as I ended. And then I kind of fell off saying it because I thought, man, maybe people don't quite understand what I'm talking about or whatever. And of course, you've got your lovely one, which I'll let you say in a second. But I finally want to bring it back. This is how I would like to leave you folks tonight. People, get ready. Off to you, Rich. Nice to see you again.
All right. Yeah, it was great. Well, I think one tagline that I came up with many years ago is probably still true. I used to say disclosure is impossible and inevitable. It's a bit of a paradox. It is impossible in the sense that you're still finding very little motivation for those people who are in the legacy program to give up an inch on this. And they're still not willing to. You can see that. But there's perhaps an inevitability about this in the sense that, too much has come out, and one does sense that there's perhaps enough momentum that is built on this subject that it's just not going to go away anytime soon. That doesn't mean the disclosure is tomorrow, or we're going to have some kind of grand reconciliation and all the truths will come out and everyone will be happy. I don't expect that. I don't even know if it'll happen by the end of my lifetime. I'm not really sure. But I do think that that this film was one milestone along the way. And so I'm glad it came out. I support the whole idea behind it. And I do think it would be worthwhile for people to check out.
All right. Well, congrats to Dan Farah. And Rich, I'll see you on the next episode of Need to Know.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, everyone, for joining Bryce and myself. We will be back again very soon. Bye.
See y'all soon. Bye-bye.
Need to Know is produced by Bryce Zabel and Tyler Stevens and is brought to you by Stellar Productions. You can learn more at needtoknow.today. We appreciate you and hope you'll spread the word. See you next time, because these days you really do need to know.